ISA 620, and please remind me that there's a summary book for audits. So maybe somewhere around our 2 lectures after this lecture, someone needs to remind me so that I send that summary book. It really helps to recap everything you've learned so that you can go into the exam having a knowledge of, basically everything. So that would be helpful. So someone remind me when it gets there, like 2 lectures away from this. Just remind me so that you can start using it for your revision. Yeah, so today we'll be talking about ISA 620. We're talking about using the work of an auditor. We've seen this in our past questions, right? We've seen this in our past questions, where one of the past questions was talking about using the work of an expert, I think. I might be wrong. But when
you are right, sir.
Yeah, okay, thank you. When we say an expert is basically someone who possesses skills and knowledge and experience in fields other than accounting or auditing. In this context, when we say an expert means somebody who possesses knowledge in a certain area. But in this audit context, we are talking about the auditor's expert. So this kind of expert has knowledge in some area that is not accounting or auditing. So that's what we are talking about in this context. So the auditor may use the work of an expert to provide knowledge relevant to the audit. Sometimes the auditor will be going through the audit and he or she does not have the necessary knowledge when it comes to a certain area, but they need that knowledge to be able to, go through their audit. And so because the auditor does not have this specific knowledge, they might resort to an expert. That's what we call an auditor's expert. So ISA 620 gives us situations and scenarios or examples where experts may be used by an auditor. And these include, legal opinions, right? Not audit opinions or legal opinions. So legal opinions, an auditor has no knowledge in law. So the legal opinion, obviously, it must come from someone else. It must come from someone else. Then you also have specialist valuation areas. Specialist valuation areas. Now, what do we mean by this? We talked about this some time back, where you need to value, let's say, a pension or let's say a property, right? So sometimes an auditor would need that help to be able to value things like that. And things like that, in valuing them, you need a specialist valuer, somebody who can actually value. The auditor has no clue when it comes to these things. It's very important. Very important to understand. Then let's look another area where you might need an expert is around tax compliance issues. Complex tax compliance issues. There are some kind of compliance issues that are very, very I'm projecting the slides for SCS. No one mentioned. Is it better now?
No, sir.
Oh, wow. No one was talking about it. Sorry, can you see now?
It's loading. Okay, great.
I can see now.
Oh, no one was saying it. I didn't see it. Okay, so legal opinions, that's one. Legal opinions, specialist valuation, and complex tax compliance issues. In those cases, you need a tax expert to be able to come in and help you in that regard. One thing you need to know that the ISA covers the work of the auditor's expert. And this expert is employed by the auditor. Please remember this always. Please remember this. The expert is employed by the auditor, not by the entity. The entity hasn't asked for any, it's the auditor that's doing its audit and feels that they need some expert opinion on something. So the auditor goes ahead to employ that expert. There's a scenario where the management uses the work of an expert, and that was covered under ISA 500. Now, what is the objective of ISA 620? ISA 620 allows the auditor to decide whether to use the work of an expert and assess whether that work is adequate. So here, the ISA 620 gives the auditor an understanding, on whether they need the work of an expert. Do we actually need the work of an expert or hire the services of an expert? And when the expert comes in to actually do the work, is their work enough? How do we measure that it's enough? Now let's talk a lot more about assessing the need for an expert. Obviously, when you're hiring an expert, it doesn't come for free. It does not come for free. It does not come for free at all. So assess the need for an expert. We need to do the assessment. We need to know that there's a cost attached to the use of an expert by auditors. You can't just walk into the market and say, hey, valuer, come and help me with this valuation, and you not pay the experts. So there's always a cost. The expert will charge a fee for the professional services he or she provides. It's very, very important. So how do we do this assessment? The auditor should look at it from a cost-benefit perspective. Not only from a cost perspective, not only from a benefit perspective, but a cost-benefit perspective. And I'm sure throughout your ICA, you have heard something called cost-benefit analysis, similar to something that the auditor must engage in, right? Similar to something that the auditor must engage in, cost-benefit basis. When deciding whether he needs to use an expert to assist him in obtaining sufficient appropriate evidence, the auditor should consider factors. So what are some of the factors that the auditor should consider? What are some of the factors that the auditor should consider? That's one thing that has to, you have to understand. What are some of the things that the auditor should consider? The auditor should consider the complexity of the matter. How complex is this issue? And how even significant is it? There are some items that are not that significant. It's not significant. So you need to consider the significance and complexity of the issue, how significant it is and how complex it is. Then they need to consider the risk of material misstatement. Now, this point is a very, very important point because we need to understand, to what extent will the financial statement be materially misstated if we do not deploy the services of an expert. So we need to understand factors such as risk of material misstatements. RMM, which is usually the abbreviation, is very, very important when you are performing your audit. And also you need to find out, are there alternative sources of the audit evidence? So is there another way, basically, is there another way you could go about this rather than having to, deploy the services of an expert? Is there another way? So the availability of alternative sources of evidence, very important. Any questions on this? Okay. Now let's look at the competence, capability, and objectivity of the expert. ISA 620 requires the auditor to assess the competence, capability, and objectivity of the expert. So how is it that one of us asked a very, very smart question? I've forgotten the person's name. How is it the auditor will assess the competence and objectivity of the experts. He doesn't know the work. So how is he going to assess? How is he going to assess it? It sounds, I can juxtapose this kind of assessment to what you do when you are trying to get a service from an expert, right? Even though you are not an expert, you are also not naive. You're also not naive. So if somebody comes to you and says they're a doctor, they can heal you, blah, blah, blah. Even though you are not necessarily a doctor, you've not been a doctor before, you're able to assess to a certain level. Now, here we are looking at the ways in which the auditor can assess. Number one, if they've had personal experience with previous work of that expert, fantastic. So that one, they can be able to judge. If they've had experience before, they can be able to judge. Another way they can assess them is discussion with that expert. As you begin to talk to the person, a person who knows what they are talking about, it might become clear to you. It might become clear to you. It doesn't always come across as so, because there are people who can literally scam you. So that's why there are several ways. You can also discuss with other auditors or others who are familiar with that expert's work. And that's why I was talking about the third-party principle when we are looking at this, I think, in a past question. So you might not be able to. So let's say you are going for a medical service. Then you know that I'll not be able to assess this doctor properly. So let me get a friend who finished the medical school, or who is even in the medical school, to kind of like check out and see that is this guy a real doctor or this guy is not. So something similar here. Discussion with other auditors or others who are familiar with that expert's work. Very, very important. Then knowledge of that expert's qualification. So this one too, we talked about, if you remember, you need to, the person said he's a doctor, okay, where's your license? Because once you're an expert, and that's why things like accounting, medicine, all those things, engineering, they all have license, because it's an easy way to assess, someone's competence. Once you've chatted, there's a body or an institution backing you, saying that, this person is real, this person is an actual accountant. So knowledge of that expert qualification, member of a professional body or industry association, license to practice, or other forms of external recognition. Another way is that the published papers. So this happens in academia a lot. Published papers. What have you published? And who is even in what journals, or what journals are you even publishing? Or what kind of books have you written? So if you look at this thing holistically, and you're able to assess that, this is what you need to do to assess the competence. Okay. Now, more into assessing the work of an expert. ISA 620 requires the auditor to apply the procedures set out below when using the work of an expert. So the auditor shall do certain things. Number one, the auditor has to obtain an understanding of the expert's field of expertise. You are going to contract someone to do something for you. It's only prudent to understand the person's work of expertise. You don't have to understand every single detail, but have a general understanding of what kind of thing the expert does, because that will help you to determine the scope and objectives of the expert's work, and to also help you to evaluate how adequate their work is. You need to understand what they do. So it's just like maybe you are going to buy a car, right? If you are going to buy a car, at least you don't need to know how they are able to get a car to run on wheels or how the tires operate. But you need to know a little bit about cars, you know, a little bit about cars, so that when you enter the showroom to buy a car, it's easier for you to have the conversation and know what to do. So this whole thing about auditors experts is similar to what, you know, a lot of us do when, for example, you are going to buy a car. You go to buy a car, some people take a mechanic with them, you know, to help them make that decision, or help them in the process. Okay, number 2, agree terms of engagement with the experts. You know, the auditor has to agree the terms of engagement so that everybody is clear on what they are doing. So the scope and objectives of the expert's work, the responsibilities, the confidentiality requirements, all of these things must be in place. It's very, very important. All of these things must be in place. There shouldn't be a situation where it's like we do not know exactly what each person is doing. Then we need to also, the auditor needs to evaluate the adequacy of the expert's work. You know, what do we mean by that? By the adequacy of the expert's work? You know, the same way the auditor has an objective for sufficient and appropriate evidence, is similar inkling here. The expert's work must be adequate. It must be adequate in terms of being able to facilitate the auditor's work, right? So the auditor has a certain objective in mind, and the expert's work must be sufficient enough, at least in that area, to be able to help the auditor make an opinion on whatever financial statements they are auditing or control they are working on. So they look at the reasonableness of the expert's conclusions. They look at the consistency of those conclusions with other audit evidence. So they look at their audit evidence and they look at the expert's conclusions as well to see whether there's any consistency there. They also look at the assumptions, you know. Sometimes you can't critique people's work, but if you know the assumptions, you can critique the assumptions. So are the assumptions reasonable? You know? And also the data that they are using, is it relevant? Is it complete? And is it accurate? You know. Any questions here? Okay, then now let's move on to reference to the auditor's experts in the audit report. You know, because the auditor has used the work of an expert, there are certain things that we need to keep in mind here. Certain things that we need to keep in mind here. So the auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion, right? So just think about it this way. Think about when a doctor is trying to diagnose you of a certain disease, you need a nurse, a lab technician. But the diagnosis he gives to you is solely like opinion on how you are feeling or what he thinks. But sometimes he'll say, oh, go to the lab and get your blood pulled. He's doing all those things to achieve a purpose or to give you an opinion. I hope that's a clear example. So the auditor has sole responsibility for the audit opinion issued, and this is not reduced in any way by his use of an expert. Therefore, he should not refer in his report to the use of an expert. The auditor is supposed to take full responsibility for this. So you can't go to the doctor and say, oh, the doctor will say, oh, no. It's the nurse's fault, or is the lab technician's fault, this one fault. The auditor in this case must take full responsibility for the audit reports, and he should not refer unless it is required by the law or regulation. Even then, or if the auditor refers to the expert's work in his report, because it is relevant to an understanding of a modified opinion. You know, so if it's supposed to give some understanding, in those cases, of a qualified opinion, in those cases, sometimes the auditor can do that, but he must make it clear that him referring to the experts does not in any way reduce his responsibility for the opinion. So what are we saying here? The auditor is fully responsible. So this approach reinforces the point made earlier that the auditor remains fully responsible for the reports produced. Very, very important. So the auditor in this case cannot simply accept work performed by experts. The auditor must evaluate that work. They must evaluate that work. That's why it's very, very key. You must evaluate that work. It's like when you're going to the showroom to buy a car and take a mechanic with you. Yes, the mechanic is an expert, but you are the one paying the money, right? So you also have to, you know, the final, if you pay the money and the car is not good, you know, you can't go and catch the mechanic and say, mechanic, you know, give me my money. The onus is on you. So that's why you have to evaluate the work of the experts. Now let's talk about reliance on internal audits. We've talked about reliance on the auditor, the experts. Let's talk about reliance on internal audits. In many instances, the work of the external auditors and internal auditors may overlap. Internal auditors, usually organizations will have their own internal audit team, especially when the internal audit department carries out financial audits. In principle, the external auditors may be able to reduce the amount of testing and checking they carry out for the external audits. So when, as an auditor, when you're going to audit an organization, they have a solid internal audit team that have carried out some audits themselves. In principle, it reduces your work because you can rely on some of the work that has already been done, you know, that has already been done by the internal auditors. Sorry. Reliance by the external auditor on the work of the internal auditors should lead to a more efficient and cost-effective audit. So what are we saying here? We are saying that in situations where you are relying on an internal audit, you know, it's more efficient. It's not like you are swallowing hook, line, and sinker, but it gives you some comfort, you know, especially where you are evaluating the work of the internal auditors. It helps you to produce a more efficient and cost-effective auditors. However, the external auditor has a problem, right? So the problem is being reiterated here again. The external auditor is responsible for his opinion on the financial statements. The external auditor can be pointing figures. Is this one fault? Is this one fault too? So even if he has relied on the work of others, such as internal auditors and external experts, you know, so the same situation here again. The auditor has full responsibility. That is the external auditor. So in situations where they rely on the work of the internal auditors, they still have their responsibilities. So what does the external auditor need to do? They must be satisfied that they can rely on the work of the internal auditors to support the external audit opinion. You know, so the evaluation, you know, it's like the way they say, verify before you trust. verify before you trust. So you need to verify. You need to verify. That's what the external auditor, because at the end of the day, they are responsible for the opinion. Any questions on that? Okay. ISA 610 provides guidance to the external auditor who has decided that the entity's internal audit function is likely to be relevant to its audit. The objectives of the external auditor are then to decide what is the extent to which we should use this internal audit department's work. Which areas, what extent? Do we even need to use it? You know, these are some considerations that the auditor must make when it comes to when it comes to the work of the auditor. They also need to know whether that work is adequate for the purposes of the external audit. Is it even adequate? Is it sufficient enough? Very, very important. But how do they determine if it's adequate? They can only tell that if they're able to evaluate the internal audit function. You see, evaluation, I've mentioned it like 10 times. Evaluate the internal audit function and its procedures. You know, so after that evaluation, that's when they can make a decision as to whether the internal auditor's work can be used as part of evidence on which the audit opinion will be based. It's very, very important. So I go on to give some considerations that should be made. Some considerations that should be made. Now, what are some of these considerations? Very, very important. It says the following factors should be considered by the external auditors in making the assessment of internal audit. Number one, the status of the internal audit departments within the entity. What is the status of the internal audit department within the entity? What is the status? Now, what do we mean by the status? We are looking